Larry Bograd, welcome to the Apollo Papyrus podcast.
Thank you, Aaron, for having me.
Feel free to introduce yourself to our listeners.
Okay. I was born and I grew up in Denver, Colorado. Both my parents were moved here from the East Coast. On my dad's side, I'm actually first generation American. He came from Eastern Europe. My mom's family did as well, though she grew up in New York City. And I had a kind of typical suburban boyhood until a couple of weeks after my 13th birthday, when my father, who was a physician, killed himself. And the story of my trying to understand him and learn more about him and deal with the trauma that his death caused is the focus of the memoir, Blood Flow, that I'm sure we're going to focus on. Anyway, I wrote a first version of the memoir when I was 19 years old. It wasn't very good, but some of those memories were really, really fresh. So it's been important to me as I wrote subsequent drafts to kind of have that repository of experiences and feelings accurate, rather than trying to, bang my head against a wall trying to remember stuff. I went to grad school in Seattle, University of Washington. I got a degree in creative writing. I went to New York with a novel under my hand that I thought would start my career as a serious literary novel. That didn't happen, but I did kind of back into a job working as an editor as a children's book company. And there I wrote a book for an illustrator that we wanted to work with, and the book ended up being selected Best Book of the Year for Children. I was 25 years old. So for the next decade or so, I published more children's books, picture books, young adult books, grades for novels for middle grade readers. But I always kind of took on topics that weren't necessarily approved for children, let's say. And so eventually, a couple of my young adult novels were banned in certain states, not bought for their public or school systems, and that kind of took care of that writing part of my career. And then I moved back to Denver in my early 30s. I got hooked into a theater playwright group at the local professional theater where I met my wife. And then I taught college for 10 years. And then I kind of morphed into instructional design. So for the past couple decades, I've made my living as an instructional designer. While I've continued to write, my wife and I made a couple of documentary films. I had some plays produced around the country. So that's kind of a quick summary for you.
Your most recent book is your memoir, which is titled Blood Flow. Without spoiling too much about your memoir, what is that about?
Well, as I indicated earlier, it's about my decades-long search to understand my father, both in terms of a lot of his early life that I didn't know that much about. I was, 12, 13 years old, and as you know, at that age, you're not really interested in your parents very much. And then I obviously wanted to get some background on why he killed himself. And so I did a lot of exploration. I actually, when I was in my early 20s, I actually went to Europe and stopped in Trieste, Italy, where my dad was a doctor, army doctor after the war, and he dealt with some of the Holocaust survivors and what were then called displaced persons camps. I also went further east into what was then the Soviet Union, to the town where he was born, and naively expected that I would learn something about him or my family there. But, that was kind of, as I said, kind of innocence. I also was able, with some effort, to get prior hospitalization records of my dad's, two of which I didn't know about while he was alive. My parents kept his mental health history pretty much a secret. And then I also interviewed my mom. I interviewed the uncle that my father had a medical practice with. I found other relatives that I had never met before who gave me a sense of my dad as a young person. And, it took me draft after draft to get the book to a point where I thought it was pretty solid. And so the title refers to blood in terms of family, and it also in terms of flow, in terms of, a journey and a story and genealogy. And that's kind of a quick synopsis of the book.
I think you mentioned earlier in the interview that you started writing what became Blood Flow in your late teens and then picked it back up later in life. Is it true that your own open heart surgery was the reason why you finished writing Blood Flow?
Well, yes and no. I mean, I had written a couple of drafts before it, but I wasn't really happy. I tried it as a third person novel. I tried it as a first person novel. I tried writing it as a kind of journalistic approach. I never quite figured out the structure. I never quite figured out the chronology. And then, as you indicated, I had totally unexpected heart surgery when I was 53 years old. And I wouldn't say it re-traumatized me, but it made me, my dad died at age 49. So when I had the heart surgery, it kind of put me in an emotional state where I was determined to do what my dad didn't do, which is uh, not make my wife a widow and not make my three daughters fatherless. They were then roughly in age from about 16 to 20. So then, since that was probably one of the other more traumatic moments in my life, I decided to weave these things together into the memoir, so they sort of alternate in terms of what the narrative focus is.
Why did you ultimately decide to write it as a memoir instead of, like, say, a narrative historical non historical fiction book or a narrative nonfiction?
I think largely because some of my readers had indicated that some of the drafts they read weren't really hearing my voice, in the way that they knew me in terms of conversation and other writings. And secondly, some writers basically said that there was emotional depth that was missing at the time. That I think a lot of people who write biography and narrative nonfiction can only kind of guess at since they're not inside someone's head. And that also part of discovering the right voice for this was my younger brother saying at one point that he read the draft, but what was missing from it, which he appreciated in me, was humor. So again, if you're to write a nonfiction book, you tend not to, make kind of linguistical jokes or, just self-deprecating comments or things like that. So I think the reason so that's largely the reasons I decided to write it as a memoir was just because it allowed me the kind of depth of feeling and also to really use my own voice that I've developed as a writer over the decades.
In addition to Blood Flow, you've written numerous other books. I think these, most, if not all of these, are children's middle grade or young adult books. And these include Bad Apple, Bernie Entertaining, and that's not a Bernie Sanders reference, Egon, Felix in the Attic, Los Alamos Light, Lost in the Store, Poor Gertie, The Better Angel, The Fourth Grade Dinosaur Club, and The Colacall Papers. Without spoiling too much about those books you've written, what are each of them about? And if you miss a couple of them, that's okay.
Well, I've always been very interested in politics, so a lot of those books had a kind of political bent in them. And I also wanted to be a little bit of a rebel, which I learned I learned in the hard way that sometimes being a rebel isn't the best approach to having a successful children's book career. For instance, Felix in the Attic is about a young boy who's locked in the attic of his home. We don't really know why, but he ends up creating his own life up there. He collects rainwater, he builds furniture, he finds books to read, he finds some vegetable seeds and starts a little garden box, things of that nature. And so when they finally, and his family's pretty benign. I mean, we meet them in one panel and they're not cruel or malicious or abusive. But when they unlock the door, he's not sure he wants to come down. So, a lot of reviewers thought that I was writing a blueprint for child abuse, but at the same time, it won this big national award. Egon was about a young creature who got fed up with his family and packed his bags and left. Again, some critics took umbrage at the fact that I would tell kids to leave their families. I mean, kind of ridiculous things like that. But he eventually joined a circus. He's an artist. Lost in the Store was based on something that happened to me a lot as a kid, where my mother, who was a pretty good sized consumer, we'd go to the department store together, and even though I was pretty young, she would tell me to just meet her back in the front of the store like in 90 minutes. So once I got over the shock of being left alone in a big department store, I kind of nosy from department and, you know, look at the books and try on hats and things like that. So that's what that book's largely about. The Colico Paper was a book about what was then called refuseniks, which were Soviet citizens who smuggled out information to try to negatively affect the Soviet regime. It's about a boy who has to make a decision whether he's going to do this after his father and mother are both arrested. Bad Apple, another book that was banned because it was about a juvenile delinquent and had a lot of drug use and a fair amount of violence. It was actually based on something that happened when I was living in New York, where an older couple in upstate, their house was burglarized, their safe was burglarized, and then they were murdered, and everybody thought it was some kind of professional hit job. But later, a teenager on the schoolyard bragged about it, so it ended up that he and a friend had actually committed this murder. Los Alamos Light, I wrote, some time ago when there was a real wave of high anxiety about a nuclear war. And it was about the Los Alamos Project, but told from the vantage of a young teenage girl whose father is recruited by Robert Oppenheimer, and they have to move to New Mexico. And then what? And then The Better Angel was another book that got me into serious trouble, because basically it was my take on teenage sex, drugs, and rock and roll, which again, some censors felt teenagers shouldn't be reading about the very things that they were doing. And then my last young adult book was about a teenager who takes a car trip from Denver to the West Coast to learn more about his dad, who was a Air Force pilot who got shot down during the end of the Vietnam War. And he talked to friends and other veterans about trying to get information about his father. So when I kind of ran the table with young adult books, I did 3 middle grade readers. Poor Gertie, another book that was banned, is about a young girl who lives in poverty and escapes into her imagination to create an alternative reality that she names after herself, Gert's World. And again, some erstwhile's protector of children's morality said no one should be writing a book about a poor kid. And then I wrote a couple more lighthearted book, a book about a book about Burning Entertainer, about a kind of wise ass fourth grader, obviously based on me. And then the last book was called Fourth Grade Dinosaur, which was about 2 boys who were digging in their backyard looking for trying to unearth dinosaur bones. But their friendship kind of runs into a big conflict due to racism, because one of the boys is Latino and the other one's Anglo. So that's kind of a quick run through of my past.
Yeah, that's quite an interesting collection, quite varied in terms of intended age range and content.
Yeah, one thing I'd make a point to you because I know you have a lot of writers, Aaron, that listen to your podcast.
Yeah.
Is I never wanted to repeat myself. So every time I wrote, I try to write about, a different book, a different narrator, sometimes a different time period, where quite frankly, and now it's kind of also part of success as an adult writer. I think a lot of people just wrote series, like all the Star Wars books are loosely based on Star Wars, or a lot of these fantasy books or Mockingbird books. And so basically, publishers would tell you that the only way you're going to make a living as an author is to write a book that can basically run into dozens and dozens of sequels and prequels and things like that. So, I mean, I chose not to do that, but that was the one thing looking back that I kind of wonder about sometimes.
Some of your books have been translated into Danish, French, German, Japanese, and Swedish. Although I don't think there's any one of your books that's been translated into all five of those.
That's correct. Yep.
How are you able to get some of your books translated into languages other than the language you write in, which is English?
Well, at the time, I had a literary agent in New York, very well respected literary agents, and almost without exception, literary agents have relationships with either somebody overseas who handles a territory for translations and tries to, has a number of books that person's trying to place with foreign publishers. Sometimes either the publisher or the literary agent has direct relationships with foreign publishers. So it's a pretty heavy lift for an author to try to get translated by themselves. And typically it's going to be through the publisher and or a literary agent who handles what's called subsidiary rights.
Now, are all your books traditionally published, or are some of them independently and or hybrid published?
All my books for children and young adults were commercially published. I was published by some good publishers like Ferris Strauss, Harper, Macmillan, Delacour Dale, Lippincott. But I'd been away so long from publishing that it was hard for me to get an agent interested in my memoir. So it ended up being published by a small independent press, which has its advantages and disadvantages. Some of the advantages is that it got into print rather quickly, and the press, didn't have a lot of titles, so they paid, very close attention to my book, both editorially and design-wise. Some of the challenges of working with an independent press, as I'm sure you and some of your listeners are aware of, is that, they're small. Many of them do not have a marketing department, much less a marketing person. They may not be set up to try to find somebody who can help with foreign translations or try to place your book as a TV or movie. So, it's kind of a mixed bag. As an author, I tended to do a lot more marketing, self-marketing, working with an independent publisher, Global Arts Press, than I typically would have done with a big New York commercial publisher.
You've written theater and screenplays. What are some theater and screenplays that you've written?
Well, my wife and I ran a theater company because we realized she's a wonderful writer, playwright. Trying to get your play produced around the country is almost as frustrating as trying to get a book published by a big commercial publisher. So we started our own writing theater company, and we did a lot of our own scripts. So I wrote a kind of comedy satire about a lab technician who will fake results to be successful. I wrote a political book about an explosion in a mine in the Rocky Mountains I don't live far from, that the investigation into can influence a senatorial campaign that's underway. I was commissioned by Karen Silkwood's union to write the, quote, true story of her. Some of your readers may be familiar with the movie Silkwood with Meryl Streep and Cher. It was about a union organizer in Oklahoma who became a whistleblower and exposed her company to a lot of underhanded stuff, including a lot of safety violations. It was a nuclear plant, so people were coming down with cancer. And then my wife had written a one-act play called Contents of Her Purse, which is about all the crazy things that women keep in their purse and how you can try to get to know a woman just by the objects that they keep in their purse. And we turned it into a documentary film with the same title. And basically, we interviewed girls as young as 4 or 5 who talked about, this is the toy I got at the pancake house, to teenagers who are always talking about, the latest phone and how they were never off of it, to moms whose diaper bags were their phone, to working women whose briefcases were their phones, and then we interviewed both of our moms who were both seniors at the time. And the things that they carried in their purse were like handicap parking, extra batteries for their hearing aids. So it was a kind of whimsical take. Um, and then I was on the board of directors of the local African American theater company, and in talking with the artistic director, he asked me to write a novel. Oh, I'm sorry, about a play about Frederick Douglass, and so I did a lot of research into Frederick Douglass, which was very interesting. I mean, he's probably one of the greatest Americans. Um, but we also had the ability to find a local choir called the Spirituals Project that by design was racially integrated. So there's two actors. One plays the young Douglas, one plays the older Douglas, and then at the end of the show, the curtain comes up and you hear this. You can see this choir singing Negro spirituals, or what was then called Negro spirituals. And I grew up going to camp, not even realizing that most of the folk songs that we know, Wade in the Water, Follow the Drinking Gourd, all kinds of stuff. Joshua Fought the Battle of Jericho, were actually started on plantations and were sung by African American slaves. And so a fairly affluent theater goer who went to the play version said he would give us money to do a documentary about the history of the spirituals. And there's a fair number of documentaries out there about gospel music, and a lot of people confuse gospel with spirituals, but they're actually very different. Spirituals are much older. They tend to be more mournful. They also discuss the hardships of enslavement, but also kind of end with an elevated hope that they'll be redeemed and saved one day, where gospel music is more upbeat, obviously. It has a lot more focus on Jesus and Christianity rather than the experience of slavery. And usually most of it starts pretty upbeat and it ends pretty upbeat. So it turned out that no one had ever done a documentary, a feature-length documentary about the spirituals. So, we talked to choir members, we talked to academics who were experts about this particular genre of American music. So that's kind of what that other documentary was about. And it got into a couple of film festivals and won an award for best music at one. But we had a distributor for it who went out of business, and so it was hard to see any return on that documentary.
One final question. What do you love most about living in the Denver, Colorado area?
Well, there's a couple things. I mean, one, I grew up here, so it's home. When I was growing up, it was called a flyover city because largely it was ignored by the country. It was considered a cow town. So there was a real Western feel to it. But, it was a kind of a small, big city. You could get across town in about 10 minutes. I love the weather out here, which has no humidity typically, but it does have four seasons, a very long fall. Over the decades, though, it became one of the meccas for people to move to. So it's now very overcrowded. The traffic's horrible. It's this town has lost a lot of its Western flavor, and instead is largely about skiing, craft beer, and Colorado was the first state to legalize marijuana, so that's another kind of interest. So I think it's kind of lost a lot of its one-time kind of cultural life, but this isn't the only city that kind of thing has happened to.
Larry, thank you for appearing on the Apollo Papyrus podcast. You were a wonderful guest to interview.
Well, thank you, Aaron. I appreciate it, and I appreciate the opportunity to reach out to your audience.
This podcast episode is intended for the private listening of our audience. Any reuse or retransmission of this podcast episode without the express written consent of the podcast host is prohibited except under fair use guidelines. Royalty-free music and sound effects obtained from https://www.zapsplat.com.